Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming out to Genealogy Day 2018. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm the Adult and Teen Services Manager here at the Fountaindale Public Library. We're super happy to have you all here. For our Genealogy Day program, there's 3 sessions of an hour apiece with all of the handouts that are available both in person and online. So to all of our online streaming guests, hello, we're happy to have you. This morning's session, we're going to start off with Dropsy, Quinsy, and Consumption presented by Kimberly Nagy of What's My Lineage. So please give Kimberly a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Can you all hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Good morning. We're going to start off, after that warm-up there by Deb, we're going to start off talking about death and illness and all sorts of sad things. But hopefully you'll learn a little bit about why it's important to know what kind of illnesses our ancestors had. Just by way of introduction, I am a former trauma surgeon. So I did go to medical school. I did do all the medical stuff. And I did treat patients with dropsy, quinsy, and consumption, although they had a little different names at that when I was treating them. So we'll go through several different ways to find out what exactly ailed our ancestors. We'll start off with talking about death records, obituaries, cemetery records, coroner records, hospital records, military census, and finally, just some family photographs and some other things that you might find. Starting off with death records, okay? This is a good way to find out what killed your ancestor. Death records started to be kept in the late 1800s, mainly for public health reasons. The government started to realize that, you know, if we figured out what all of our people are dying from, maybe we can start containing the diseases. And it was really more for epidemics and containment of infectious diseases. But they started to mandate that local governments keep death records. And most governments started keeping something like this. This is a death register from Muskingum County, Ohio. And there's several columns here with information on it. What you'll see, most importantly for our purposes, is this last column here where it talks about what did they die of. The rest of this is the name, the date of death, their age, where they were living at the time of death. But if you look at this last column, you'll see things like scrofula, rheumatism, consumption, dropsy, and of course, my favorite, unknown. In 1879, the National Board of Health sort of formalized the process and started to require governments to keep more formalized certificates. And I think we're all familiar with certificates that look something like this. Nowadays, all the governments keep these. These are standardized death certificates with pretty standard information on them. This information is kept, you can find it either at the local county level usually, but also at the state health department. Almost always has copies of this. So this is my great-great-grandfather from 1936. And it's, again, it has the standard information. He was male, he was married, his age at death. But for our purposes, what killed him, we look over here under the medical certificate of death, usually filled out by the physician who was treating him at the time, possibly filled out by the coroner. And it says here, he died of cerebral hemorrhage, contributed to by arterial sclerosis. So we know that he had some sort of hardening of the arteries, and he died of a stroke. There's also this little number over here, and you'll see these numbers on these death certificates. It could be written anywhere. Here it's written under date of onset, but it's clearly not a date. It may be written under a contributory cause of death. It may be written down here by the signature. We'll talk about those little numbers in a little bit. And just a little blow up there of what that little number is. Again, clearly it's not a date, but it can be important for our research. Another good source of information on a cause of death would be an obituary. The obituary might actually list the cause of death. This is my grandfather. He died. He had gone there a few days ago, had an operation for appendicitis, and died as a result of that. Another obituary, here it says she died of leukemia. Now, if it didn't actually say leukemia in the obituary, you might get a clue down here where, contributions could be to a charity, such as the Leukemia Society in her case, the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society. That sort of gives you a clue that that's something that was important to your ancestor, important to your ancestor or possibly their family. So again, another little clue as to what killed our ancestors. Funeral home records are also another source, and I know you're going to hear more about this later today. But this is an example from a funeral home in Clay County, Indiana. And this is a wonderful record set that they have there, where they have listed everybody that was taken care of, all the clients, I guess you could call them, of the funeral home. And it tells you what they died of. Here's someone who died of brain fever. He was 1.5 months old. Lung fever, thrush, consumption. Again, another source of information as to what might have killed our ancestors. Coroner records are a wonderful source of death information as well. The source down here on the bottom comes from Coles County, Illinois, down near Mattoon in that area. And here it's got the verdict of the coroner's jury. This gentleman died of carcinoma of the prostate. He had metastases to his lungs and his skeletal system. So now we know what this gentleman died of. This record set is from the Secretary of State in Missouri. These are both online. This is at Family Search. This is online at the Missouri Secretary of State. Again, they list just basic information. If you want more information, you can get the record. But here's an interesting clue. This gentleman died of an accident, injuries caused by work at the railroad. So now you have another place to look for information on this gentleman. Not only did you now know how he died, but you have a clue as to where he might have been working during his life. Just helps us fill in a lot of the details about our ancestors. Hospital records can be very interesting if you can find them. They often are very difficult to obtain because of HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And HIPAA, we're all familiar, I think, with HIPAA. Whenever you go to the doctor's office, you sign a piece of paper that says, I understand that you're not going to give any of my information away and all of that. So nowadays, we're very strict about what medical information that we pass on to people. In the past, it was maybe not quite so strict. Some of these can be found either in local archives, university archives. You might actually be able to find some online. This is a finding aid. Excuse me. This is a finding aid for Cornell Hospital in New York City, and it says these are the records that we have in our archives. And they have medical records for various institutions. Look at this. New York Hospital goes back to 1794. Whoops, sorry about that. New York Hospital back to 1794. You've got several asylums, asylum for lying-in women. That was basically the maternity hospital. Asylum, it was just another name for hospital in many cases. The infant asylum is a pediatric hospital. But they have all of these various records, and if you thought that your ancestor might have been treated in one of these various hospitals, you can contact Cornell University and ask them to send you the record. Now, they do have a HIPAA form for you to sign that says, yes, I understand that, this is for research purposes, and my ancestor is long dead. I mean, obviously, 1794, no, you're not too worried about living privacy anymore. There's some actual records online, and this came from Ancestry, actually. This is a register of patients that were seen at the Navy Hospital in 1879. And so basically the corpsman who was seeing patients at the Navy Hospital kept a log of all the patients that he saw. Again, interesting information, the usual, the patient's name, their age, where they were from, what their occupation was, and these are the occupation before they joined the Navy. This gentleman was a farmer. When they were admitted to the hospital, what unit they were in, where they were. There we go. Oh, come on, back. There we go. A little bit of a delay. Okay. And then again, what they were seen at the hospital for. Peritonitis, we've got syphilis, contusions, a whole host of various ailments. Again, not only do you get information on the illness that your ancestor was suffering from, but as you saw, you can get information on their birthplace or their age. Clues to further research. Excuse me. Oh, goodness. Okay, so this is another record. This is online at the Indiana Genealogical Society. And this is a list of blind persons in the state of Indiana. So because the Indiana Hospital for the Blind, or Institution for the Blind, was a state institution, they were required to make a report annually. And it's all public records because it's a state institution. And so you get information, again, on age, what the cause of blindness was. Again, in 1846, we weren't real sure of a lot of the causes. But importantly, we have information on the parents, the guardians, and where they lived. So you can get a lot of information looking for hospital records, not only the cause of death or the cause of illness. Military records also give us a lot of information. This is an invalid pension application for my great-great-grandfather. And, again, a lot of more information than just, what his illness is. We know where he's from, what company he served in, where he mustered in, where he was discharged. And down here, the reason he's applying for his invalid pension is because he had rheumatism, piles, and a gunshot wound of his left hip. Not only that, he had diseases of his heart and his lungs. He sounds pretty sick for a soldier, doesn't he? Keep in mind that if you're applying for a pension for disability, you're going to make it sound really bad. But, nevertheless, he at least had some sort of complaints related to this. Not to discredit my grandfather, but the census can also give us information. We're all familiar with looking at the census, looking for their name, their age, what state they were born in. But there's all these little tick marks off to the side. Have we ever paid attention to those little tick marks? The little tick marks give us information. It varies a little bit based on which census you're looking at, but they'll tell you if the patient is, if the person is deaf, dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, these are their terms, or a pauper. Apparently that sort of falls in with disability as far as the census takers are concerned. The censuses from 1850 up till about 1880, 1900 have these little tick marks on them. So again, it's a place to look for more information. And sometimes you can even find it indexed. This is an index of all of the deaf, dumb, blind, idiot, all the little tick marks in the 1880 census. The defective delinquent schedule is what it's called. While we're talking about census, I need to talk about mortality schedules. Mortality schedules were taken between 1850 and 1890. And basically, the census taker was supposed to ask, did anyone in the household die in the year preceding the date of the census? So this is the mortality schedule from 1850 for Sauk County, Wisconsin. Here we have George Blakesley. This is someone I was researching. George Blakesley was 26. He died in April, and he died of consumption. Now, in 1850, a 26-year-old, he didn't appear anywhere else in terms of a death record. There were no death records being kept in 1850. He died at 26. He left a young widow and a few small children. She couldn't afford a tombstone. This is the only record I have that tells me when this gentleman died. So mortality schedules can be very useful. You know, unfortunately, they only occur once every 10 years, and they may or may not be complete. If the family had moved away, if there was nobody left in that family to talk to the census taker, they might not have been included. Now, I mentioned that the mortality schedules were kept up until 1890. And you all know that the 1890 census is essentially, for all intents and purposes, gone. There's just a very few schedules left of that. But the DAR in the early 1900s took the 1890 mortality schedules and indexed them, and then sent the books back to the National Archives, and then they were subsequently lost. So you can find 1890 mortality schedules have been published, even though the 1890 census has been lost. So that's a nice little clue if you're looking for someone who died 1889, 1890. You might find some information just in your family effects. This gentleman, he was the father-in-law of my sister-in-law. So distant relation, essentially. Here he is in a wheelchair. Now you might wonder, why is, what was going on? Why is he in a wheelchair? And this is a picture from Christmas. Well, if you look in his high school yearbook, 1948, here it gives this gentleman's name. He was the treasurer of the FFA in their community for their high school. He suffered an attack of polio in October, and they had to find somebody else to serve in his absence. So you can find clues in unexpected places. A family Bible. We're all used to family Bibles giving us dates, hopefully relationships. This family Bible, this is from a distant relative. Here we have this gentleman died in Somerset County on April 15th, 1844, I believe it is, of consumption. Someone else down here died of heart disease. So back again in 1840s, we may not have a whole lot other death information. So the family Bible could give us a clue. Now I mentioned those little numbers. What do those little numbers mean? Those little numbers can actually be very helpful to us at times. And again, they could be written anywhere. This one, this little number here is written under major finding of operation. Well, those numbers refer to the International Classification of Disease. The International Classification of Disease started in France in the late 1800s as, again, a unified method of tracking the cause of death. This was at around the same time that the National Center for Public Health also started tracking causes of death. The United States began using these in 1898. And now the International Classification of Disease, or you may have heard of the ICD, is essentially a unified method used to track all sorts of illnesses, not just death. They use it for the insurance companies. When the doctors chart information on their patient, for a patient visit, they have to say not only what the diagnosis is, but also the code. Now, we're up to ICD-10 version. And if you can buy this online, I wouldn't advise it, but if you're really interested, you could buy it online. It's 1,250-page booklet, okay? It's huge. And with codes and modifiers and all sorts of information, as well as guides on how to use it. But it can be useful for our purposes for older records. I've given you this link in the syllabus, wolfbane.com. This gentleman has gone through and taken all these ICD lists, all 10 versions of them, and you can go to his website and type in, you know, what ICD code you're interested in. You find a number on the death certificate, and it'll come up and tell you what the disease is, what the diagnosis is. This is the pocket reference from 1909. This is ICD-2, and this was the physician's pocket reference. It was much, this whole thing has been digitized online, but it's grown quite a bit. One of the reasons that it's now 1,250 pages is because we're getting better at making diagnoses, and we're also making all sorts of little sub-diagnoses and subcategories. The other thing is, back, you know, 1900, 1909, we didn't understand disease a whole lot. So we didn't have a lot of description. We knew that somebody died of an infection, but we didn't know exactly what the infection was, for example. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of how this can be useful. So this is, again, one of my great-grandparents. And if you were looking at this and you were having trouble maybe reading this, what exactly did he die of? Well, it looks like it says bronchitis, something gastritis, I don't know. If you go and look up the code, and here you find out. The code number 103 is other disease of the stomach, okay? Gastric cancer had one code. Everything else of the stomach had another code. So these can be very useful if you can't read the death certificate. If it's hard, you know, doctor's handwriting is not always the best. It's important to use the edition that was in use prior to whatever was published prior to when your ancestor died to get the correct code. Another one of my great-grandparents, again, cerebral hemorrhage. The code is 74A. I'm not sure if that's going to tell me anything more or not. It basically says, yes, it's cerebral hemorrhage. So it can be helpful, especially if you're having trouble with handwriting. Now, what about some of these terms for diseases, okay? Go through and you read some of these death certificates and you're not sure exactly what does that mean. You know, there's a lot of archaic terms, again, because we didn't understand disease very well back then. And these three websites are listed on your handout. The first two, Pierce and this one, are nice, easy references. Archaic medical terms is probably the most complete of the three, but it can be a little hard to search on. Basically, you go to that site and you're welcomed with a screen saying, please buy our CD with all of our terms on it. It is possible to search it and find what you're looking for, but it's not as intuitive as the other two. So we're going to talk a little bit about archaic terms. All right, so here we have someone who died of apoplexy. Does anybody know what apoplexy is? It's a stroke. It's a stroke. But if you're not sure, you go to one of these sites. This is the Pierce site, and it tells us paralysis due to stroke. All right, this one, cerebral hemorrhage, that one's kind of obvious. Contributory cause is Bright's disease. Kidney failure, very good. Again, you look it up. It's chronic inflammatory disease of the kidney, at least according to this site, but it is some sort of a kidney disease. All right. Here's a 6-month-old who died of chronic indigestion since birth, contributed by dropsy. And we talked about dropsy earlier. Dropsy was not the 8th dwarf, as someone said. What is dropsy? Well, that's what I'm going to tell you. Yeah. So any thoughts what dropsy is? It can be congestive heart failure. It can be kidney disease. It's basically edema, a lot of swelling, a lot of excess fluid. And again, you know, back in 1915, I think, when this death certificate was, we didn't understand what caused all this swelling. We said, well, it might be heart disease, it might be kidney failure. We don't know. This one is a little hard to read. This came off of a pension application. This is Typhus. It's very hard to say. It's Phthis, Typhus. All right. This is pulmonaris, actually. Any guesses on this one? TB. Very good. All right. If you look it up on one of the sites, on the Archaic Medical Terms site, it tells you it's consumption. Well, consumption, you'll see a lot of our ancestors had, you know, consumption. But you might not know what consumption is because it is a relatively archaic term. So you look it up again, and it's archaic name for TB. So, and that's a very common diagnosis that you'll see. So I've told you a little bit about how to find out what was wrong with our ancestors, but why do we care? Why do we want to know? Well, first of all, it gives us details about our ancestors' lives. If you know that your ancestor suffered from heart failure for the last, 10 years of his life, it may give you a sense of what his life was like, what he might have been able to do during his daily life. It also may give us some clues for future research. The coroner record that I showed you, that he died from working on the railroad. Well, now you can start looking through railroad records, maybe. So it gives you more clues about that. It's also important to know for our own health if there's any hereditary illnesses. So I took the cause of death for my ancestors and put together this little pedigree chart. And unfortunately, the colors don't show up real well with the lights on. But there's myself and my mother. My mother is 93 and still going strong. And then I took everyone else and I listed the age at death and what killed them. And you're not going to be able to read it, and that's okay, just important to see the colors. Blue was heart disease. My father died of a heart attack. We have some more blue here and here, more blue, more blue. My grandfather, he was the one that died of appendicitis, so that's something infectious. So I gave him pink for infectious. Again, the colors are sort of random, but it just helps me see exactly what's going on. I have a couple relatives that died of cancer. Down here is the one that died of Bright's disease, the kidney failure. But if I were to look at this, just very quickly, what do you think I need to worry about in terms of my own health? Heart disease, right? There's a lot of blue, and it's not only is it my father and some of his ancestors, but my mother's side as well. So it's an important thing to know, and know that yes, heart disease runs in my family, and I need to go, make sure my cholesterol is okay and have all of that checked out. So it's important for our own health. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about epidemics, because these were also very important in the lives of our ancestors. The Oxford English Dictionary defines epidemic as a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. So epidemics tended to occur in cycles. They may have been seasonal, and you'll see why when we talk about a couple of them. They were often more common in cities, and that's because people were just packed together a little more closely. Especially early on, there was, we didn't have public sanitation, there was sewage in the streets, and kind of nasty. And people were all living very close together. Whole families could be affected, again, because these were infectious. And so if one person in the family got a disease, basically everybody else in the family in that household would be affected as well. And we'll talk about a couple of these. So smallpox. Smallpox was one of the most dreaded diseases in the 1600s, 1700s. And you can see why. 1 in 3, 1 in 4 would die if they were affected by smallpox. Jenner introduced inoculation in 1796, and basically what he proposed was if you take material from cowpox, from an infected cow, which was a similar disease, and give it and inject it into people, they would basically have a milder form of the disease and they wouldn't get the bad form and die. Well, in 1796, we were still bleeding people with, with leeches and such, and we said, oh, we're not going to do that. That's ridiculous. Why would you inject them with this cow material? And so he was basically laughed out of town. The learned people, the physicians of the time all said, that's ridiculous. We're going to continue to bleed them and treat them with, hot baths and keep them away from cold drafts and all of the very, modern treatments of the time. Well, as you know, science ultimately prevailed. And people started to get smallpox immunizations, and I'm sure that everyone here of a certain age or older all has their little smallpox scar on their arm from their smallpox inoculation. And smallpox has virtually been eradicated. So this is something that was extremely important in the lives of our ancestors many years ago, and now we don't even think about it. We don't worry about it at all. Cholera was another epidemic disease. And this is a sign that was posted on how to prevent cholera. You have to be temperate in your eating and drinking. Avoid raw vegetables, which actually might have some merit to it. You should probably wash the vegetables first. Abstain from cold water. Keep away from spirits. Keep warm when you sleep. Don't sleep in a draft of air. Avoid getting wet. Again, a lot of this just comes from the medical knowledge at the time. People just didn't understand where cholera came from. Cholera is a disease. It's a gastrointestinal disease, vomiting and diarrhea. It's basically passed along in areas of poor sanitation. The bacteria itself tends to reproduce in hot, humid weather, and so it was a very seasonal disease. But it was also a very dreaded disease. Typhus was another epidemic disease, and typhus could come from people being packed together in very small areas and not changing their clothes. And the reason for that is because it's carried by body lice. So, so you have people that are in jail, and they're not allowed to change their clothes. Right, they don't necessarily have clothes to change into. On ships, on board ships, when people, were crowded together for long periods of time, again, keeping the same clothes, they could get typhus. And typhus, again, was another dreaded epidemic. Now, yellow fever, that was spread by mosquitoes. And in Philadelphia, it's estimated that about 1 in 10 people of the population died during the yellow fever epidemic in 1793. This is a listing of people that are reported to have died, and it's listed by church. The churches would basically report it for every day in September. And if you look, here's, we've had 2 deaths, the next day another 2 deaths, here another 3 deaths, all in the space of a week. Down to, if you look at the totals, they were losing 60 people a day to yellow fever. Again, it's something that we don't really hear about today. Even childhood illnesses. We all, are familiar with, taking your infant for vaccines, getting their 2-month, their 4-month, their 6-month shots against measles, mumps, rubella. Well, and the reason is that some of these childhood illnesses could also be fairly dreaded. Measles could have a 15% mortality. Scarlet fever or scarlatina, another childhood disease, now that we don't really, a baby might get a very mild version of it, but it's not really a dreaded disease anymore. Even diphtheria, you rarely hear of that because, again, of immunizations. My great-grandfather applied for an invalid pension from the Civil War, and his reason that he thought he needed the disability was because he had measles that affected his eyes. So he was a grown man. He was 51 when he applied, but he was in his 20s when he fought in the Civil War. A grown man is affected by measles, again, back in the 1860s, 1870s. Nowadays, we really don't worry about that too much. All right. Now, influenza, the Spanish flu, was a pandemic. I gave you the definition for an epidemic. A pandemic is essentially worldwide. So not just, like the epidemic that affected Philadelphia. This is a pandemic, worldwide, 1917, 1918. And the reason the Spanish flu was so bad was because, first of all, it affected healthy young adults. It wasn't just a childhood illness. It would affect healthy young adults. They would get sick with the flu. They would develop pneumonia, and they would usually die because of complications of pneumonia. Now, 100 years ago, we didn't have intensive care units. We didn't have ventilators. We didn't have all of the treatments now that we would use to treat patients with pneumonia. But even this past winter, we were losing some children to the recent flu outbreak. Not nearly as bad as what it was in 1917, 1918. But influenza is still a problem. So if you think your ancestor might have died as a result of an epidemic, how do we find those records? Well, keep in mind that the records might be incomplete. People were too busy taking care of the sick and burying the dead to really keep good records if it was a really bad outbreak. But you might find some clues in your cemetery records. You might see in perhaps a death register where there were multiple people dying at the same time of the same disease. You could find things in newspapers or local histories, or there's some online listings as well. This is a map based on the US Census in 1870, basically showing, it was based on the mortality schedule, and it was showing where some of the diseases were centered throughout the United States. So the people who died in the 1870 mortality census of consumption, this is sort of where they were located, and you can see it's sort of centered up in New England, but it can also be around the Midwest. Typhoid fever, malaria, the last one was intestinal diseases, which is sort of a non-specific term. Anyway, so cemetery records. So this is from New Haven, Connecticut. In 1843, this is the cemetery records. These are the interments for a given month, January of 1843. And you can see what people are dying from. There's that Typhus again. I prefer to call it consumption just because it's a lot easier to say. But there's phthisis. Here's someone who died of typhus, scarlatina, scarlatina, scarlatina. So was there a scarlatina epidemic? Possibly in 1843 in New Haven. That gives us a clue. Death records can give us similar information. Roxbury, Massachusetts lists the cause of death, and here it is, smallpox. Several people who died of smallpox here, along with some other random diseases. Coventry, Connecticut in 1775. Look at this. Coventry, Connecticut in 1775 was not a very big town. But look at all these children that died. 3 children of from Coleman, 4 children of E. Cushman, a child, the widow, another child, another child. You could just see all of these children that this community lost in a given month. And that was probably from smallpox. Newspaper accounts will tell you some information. This is from one page out of the Mansfield, Ohio newspaper on 19th of October, 1918. A single page had several articles about, again, 1918, we're in the middle of Spanish flu. And here's someone who's recovering from influenza. Here's some obituaries from people who died of influenza. The camp surgeon at Camp Sherman, which was the Army camp in the area, basically said, we're not worried about influenza, but we're still keeping our quarantine in effect. Again, more cases, more deaths. The police force in Boston has just discovered that if they use a mask, it might help with the spread of influenza. And they're still quarantining. So a lot of information just from the newspaper as well. Local histories give you a little bit of a flair as well. This is from Fairfield County, Ohio, and it talks about the oldest citizens of Lancaster describe a typhoid epidemic that prevailed in the fall of 1823. It ravaged the community. They think the mortality exceeded 1 death out of every 10. And it says, you would be surprised if you looked at the graveyard of the number of stones bearing the date of 1823. It is said that some portion of time there were not enough well persons to nurse the sick and bury the dead. And this was published in 1877. So over 50 years later, the residents of this town are still talking about, do you remember that typhoid epidemic that we had? There are listings online, and both of these are on your handout. This listing here gives you basically the known epidemics in the United States up through Spanish flu. Wikipedia listing gives you all the epidemics worldwide back to ancient times. But just for our purposes, epidemics in the US. There's a couple references on your handout if you want to delve into any of this anymore. And I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Questions? Anybody?
No? Oh, yes, yes.
Just one comment. When you talk about newspapers, I found that like 4 generations back, the daughter of one of my relatives died of smallpox. And the article started with what she had been doing that day and gave the blow-by-blow description of everything all the way through the funeral and gathering afterwards and so forth. It was like 5 columns in the newspaper.
Yes.
And I was just astounded at the detail that they gave back in the
Yes, yes. And I'm willing to bet she was one of the first ones to die of smallpox for that particular outbreak. Because as more and more people died, it became sort of less and less, it wasn't so much of a novelty anymore. But yeah, old obituaries can give you a lot of really good information. So, yes?
Just a comment. sometimes there's information on a certificate when they got an inoculation. In 1877, my grandfather, at the age of 9 months, got the cowpox inoculation. And on the certificate, and this was just outside of Vienna, Austria, it lists his birth date, the town that he was born in, and that he received that inoculation.
Yes.
So they're very helpful.
Yes, the comment was sometimes you can find information on inoculations on the certificate. I apologize, I wasn't repeating the question for the for the web audience. But yes, and sometimes you can find information, and I didn't put this in here, but if someone applied for a passport, if they were going to a country where there was a certain outbreak that was, a disease that was endemic, there might be information that says, yes, I did get my yellow fever shot, so it's okay for me to travel. So yes, occasionally you'll find information like that. Question in the back.
How accurate, especially if you're going to the late 1800s, early 1900s, are these diagnoses? I mean, I'm just curious.
Okay, the question is how accurate are the diagnoses the farther back we go. And again, our medical knowledge, we didn't understand a lot of the causes of death. So you do sort of have to take these with a grain of salt. Someone may have died attributed to, say, kidney failure when it was really they had cancer. And that was sort of the final event of the cancer. The physicians didn't understand that well at the time. They did the best they could. Yes, sir.
In the resources you give, certain things become more and more prevalent over time, certain causes of death. Do any of these give information on those changes?
I believe one of the articles gives information. The question is on prevalence and change of prevalence of cause of death over time. I can tell you in general, if you look at the diagnoses early on, a lot of them were infectious. And part of that is because people weren't living long enough to succumb to heart disease or stroke or cancer. If they were dying as children or as young adults of an infectious disease, they wouldn't have the diseases of the older population quite so much. So you will see more and more prevalence of the older type diseases in more recent records. Yes?
I have a question about both my grandmothers who died, one at age 28, and the cause was labor, pneumonia, followed by emphysema, and the lung was drained. That's on the documents. Such, in those days, what did they put on the death certificate if a woman died of giving birth?
Okay, the question is what did they put on a death certificate if the woman died giving birth? And quite often they would write something like they died of labor or they died, of in their travail. I've seen they would put that that it was somehow related. It might not be a detailed diagnosis like it is now, but they might say that it was childbirth. Yes, yes.
I think that's actually lobar pneumonia, not labor, lobar. Because I had a lot of ancestors with TB and different types of pneumonia, and it refers to the lobes of the lung.
It could be, or it could be labor and yes.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
That could be a handwriting thing.
The lobes of the lung.
Yes.
Usually with pneumonia, they would say like lobar pneumonia.
Yeah. They might say it.
I
Yes.
think some say right and left lobe.
I didn't know what that word was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what it is. I don't think it had anything to do with childbirth.
Okay. A question in the back. Yes. Blood flux. Okay. Flux was often a term for diarrhea, and if they had sort of a GI bleed, essentially, where they bled out through their colon, it could be. Yes.
In the 1880 census in Clinton County in Illinois, two of my great-grandmother's sisters were listed Y, F-I-L-E-A-S.
Erysipelas.
Do you know what that is?
Yes, yes. It's an infectious disease. It's essentially another infectious disease. It was characterized by sores on the face, usually.
Was there any treatment for it?
Not at that time. Not at that time, no.
What would they have decided, or what would they have done now?
Now there's antibiotics.
That would have cured it.
Yes. Yes, sir.
A number of my paternal relatives in Germany died of various internal things, probably stomach cancer or colon cancer. One of the obituaries said, "Something evil in the gut."
Something evil in the gut is probably a.
That's about as good as they can.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
What was lockjaw in reference to?
Lockjaw is tetanus.
Oh, and what exactly is tetanus?
Tetanus is an infection that you can get from cutting yourself on rusty nails, and it basically causes spasm, and you're unable to breathe. So keep your tetanus shots up to date. Yes.
When did autopsies become standard where they were actually performed to view the cause of death?
Autopsies have been performed for many years. Again, early on they were performed as more of a teaching method at the medical schools for the medical students to learn anatomy and such. I'd say maybe in the last 100 years, where they've actually, the coroners have done some sort of an autopsy to determine cause of death. And that's, again, much more refined now than it was. Do you have a question? Okay. Oh.
Hi, my name's Courtney. I'm an incoming medical student. I was just kind of curious about your career trajectory and how you've been able to integrate like medical history and ancestry into your medical career.
Okay. The question is, how do I integrate medical history and genealogy into my medical career? I have been a genealogist for over 40 years, since prior to medical school. It's always been a hobby, even while I was in medical school. But I've always had an interest in some of the historic causes of death as well. And just ancient, not ancient, but older treatments for various diseases. It's very interesting what our ancestors thought would actually cure something.
My personal favorite.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we'll take it, then thank you very much, and let's give our speaker one round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.